My daughter-in-law sent me a text that would have broken a weaker man. She said, "We love the house you bought us, Wallace, but my mother Dorothy thinks Thanksgiving should be just for immediate family. So please do not come." She thought she was setting a boundary. She thought she was pushing an old man out of the picture. She did not know that at the exact moment her message landed on my phone, I was holding a pen poised to sign a check for $50,000 for her dream kitchen. I did not reply with anger. I simply put the pen down. I tore that check in half. And then I did something that would make the devil himself pause. I bought the rotting, condemned nightmare of a property right next door to her pristine mansion. She wanted space. I gave her a war zone. Before I tell you how I turned her life into a construction site, let me know in the comments if you have ever been pushed aside by the people you supported. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that respect is earned, not given. I was sitting in the quiet, air-conditioned office of First National Bank when the vibration in my pocket changed the course of my retirement. Mrs. Higgins, the branch manager who has known me since I started my general contracting business 40 years ago, was smiling patiently. On the desk between us lay a cashier check waiting for my signature. The amount was $50,000. It was not a loan. It was a gift. My son Brian and his wife Brittany had been complaining that the granite countertops in the $2 million home I had purchased for them were not modern enough. They wanted quartz. They wanted a waterfall island. And because I am a father who remembers wiping his son's scraped knees, I was ready to pay for it. "Excuse me, Martha," I said, pulling out my phone. It might be Brian confirming the contractor details, but it was not Brian. The name on the screen was Brittany. I adjusted my reading glasses, expecting a thank you or a photo of the paint swatches. Instead, I read the words that made the blood run cold in my veins. The text read, "Hi Wallace, we are getting so excited for the holidays. But I have to be honest. My mother Dorothy feels a bit overwhelmed lately. She thinks it would be best if Thanksgiving was just immediate family this year. We can do a coffee catch-up next week maybe. Thanks for understanding." I read it twice. Immediate family. The words echoed in my head. I looked at the check on the desk. $50,000. I looked out the window at the town I had helped build. I thought about the deed to their house which I had paid for in cash 6 months ago, so they would not have a mortgage hanging over their heads. I thought about Dorothy Brittany's mother, a woman who had never contributed a dime to their lives, but treated my son like a servant. Dorothy, who was apparently immediate family, while I, the father and the financier, was a guest who could be uninvited via text message. "Is everything all right, Mr. Prentice?" Mrs. Higgins asked, her brow furrowing as she saw the color drain from my face. I looked at her. I looked at the check. For a split second, I considered calling Brian. I considered yelling. I considered begging to be included. But then the old instinct kicked in. The instinct that helped me survive Vietnam and 40 years in the cutthroat construction industry. You do not negotiate with terrorists, and you do not beg for a seat at a table you paid for. "Everything is clear, Martha," I said. My voice was steady, terrifyingly calm. I reached out not for the pen, but for the check. With slow, deliberate movements, I tore the paper down the middle. The sound of the ripping paper was the only noise in the room. I stacked the halves and tore them again. "Mr. Prentice," Mrs. Higgins gasped. "That is a cashier check. Here." "Void it," I said, standing up and buttoning my jacket. "Put the money back in the main account. Actually, keep it liquid. I am going to need access to a substantial amount of cash by tomorrow morning." "But the kitchen renovations," she stammered. "There will be no renovations," I said, walking toward the door. "I am about to start a different kind of project, one that requires a wrecking ball." I walked out into the blinding afternoon sun. I did not reply to Brittany. I typed 2 words, sent them, and then turned my phone off. Understood. That was all I said. They probably thought I was being a pushover. They probably clinked their mimosa glasses thinking the old man had accepted his place in the shadows. They had no idea that I was already driving toward the real estate office of an old friend ready to make a purchase that would destroy their peace forever. The house next to them, a foreclosure that had been an eyesore for years, was about to become my headquarters. Thanksgiving was canceled, but the show was just beginning. I sat in the cab of my truck, the engine idling with a low rumble that usually soothed me, but today it offered no comfort. My phone, which I had turned off in the bank, was back on. I wanted to see if my son Brian had texted, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to tell me it was all a misunderstanding. But the message inbox was empty. Instead, a notification from Facebook popped up. It was from a mutual acquaintance, a local realtor who liked to keep tabs on the market. She had liked a photo posted by Dorothy. Against my better judgment, I tapped the notification. What loaded on the screen made my grip on the steering wheel tighten until my knuckles turned white. There was a photo of the house I had purchased, the house I had inspected foundation to roof, the house I had paid for in full. Standing on the front porch holding a glass of champagne was Dorothy. She was beaming, looking for all the world like the lady of the manor. The caption beneath the photo was a masterclass in rewriting history. It read, "So incredibly proud to finally get my baby girl settled into her dream home." It has been months of hard work organizing, decorating, and making sure everything is perfect, but a mother does whatever it takes for her family. Here is to new beginnings and the legacy we build for our children. #blessed, #homeowner, #family first. I read it 3 times. There was no mention of me. No mention of the $2 million wire transfer from my retirement savings. No mention of the weeks I spent negotiating with the previous owners to get the price down. To the outside world, this was Dorothy's triumph. She had effectively erased my existence and my contribution with a single filter and a few lies. I felt a burning in my chest that had nothing to do with heartburn and everything to do with betrayal. I needed to see it. I needed to see if the reality matched the digital lie. I threw the truck into gear and drove. It was a 15-minute drive to the gated community in Barrington, a route I had driven dozens of times, with joy in my heart, thinking about my future grandchildren playing on that lawn. Today, the drive felt like a funeral procession. When I turned the corner onto their street, the sight that greeted me confirmed my worst fears. The house was magnificent. A sprawling colonial with white pillars that I had personally checked for structural integrity. But it was not the architecture that caught my eye. It was the driveway. The 3-car garage was open. The spot on the far right, the one closest to the door into the kitchen, was traditionally the spot for the head of the household. It was where I assumed Brian would park his sedan. But Brian's car was nowhere to be seen. Instead, parked diagonally across the premium spot, taking up enough room for 2 vehicles, was a white Mercedes SUV. It was fresh from the car wash, gleaming in the sun. It was Dorothy's car. And it was not just a car. It was a flag planted in conquered territory. My son's car was likely parked on the street, relegated to the curb, like a visitor in his own home. Seeing that vehicle sitting there dripping oil onto the epoxy floor I had paid to have sealed told me everything I needed to know about the hierarchy inside those walls. Brian was not the owner. I was not the benefactor. We were just the bank accounts that funded Dorothy's delusion of grandeur. I pulled my truck to the curb, but I did not get out. I just watched, letting the anger crystallize into a cold, hard plan. That was when I turned my head to the left and saw the overgrown hedge of the property next door. The solution to my problem was staring me right in the face, hidden behind a rotting fence and a foreclosure sign. The structure standing next to my son's $2 million mansion was less of a house and more of a cautionary tale. It was a foreclosure that had sat empty for 2 years, a rotting sore thumb in the middle of a manicured neighborhood. The lawn was waist-high with weeds that were slowly encroaching on Dorothy's precious hydrangeas. The siding, once white, was now a sickly shade of gray, peeling off in long strips like dead skin. A bright orange sticker on the front door declared it unsafe for occupancy. Most people in this zip code looked at that property and saw a disgrace. They saw a blight on their property values. But as I sat in my truck, looking from Dorothy's shiny Mercedes back to that crumbling porch, I did not see a disaster. I saw a fortress. I saw the perfect vantage point. I reached for my phone again, but this time I was not checking Facebook. I was dialing the number of Richard, my attorney and oldest friend. He picked up on the second ring, sounding bored, likely reviewing contracts for a client far less interesting than I was about to be. "Richard, I said, skipping the pleasantries. "Do you still have the paperwork for that shell company we set up last year? The one we never used, Phoenix Holdings, LLC. There was a pause, the sound of a chair squeaking as he sat up. "I have it, Wallace. Why are you finally buying that boat you keep talking about?" "No," I said, watching a squirrel scurry across the sagging roof of the foreclosure. "I am buying a house. 12 Elm Street. The foreclosure right next to Brian's place." Richard laughed, a dry, barking sound. "You have to be joking. I know that property. It is a tear-down, Wallace. The foundation is cracked, there is black mold in the basement, and I am pretty sure raccoons have unionized in the attic. It has been on the market for months because nobody wants to deal with the remediation costs." "I do not care about the mold, Richard," I said, my voice dropped dead serious. "I want to make a cash offer. Full asking price. No inspection. No contingencies. But there is one condition. We close in 24 hours. Silence stretched on the line. I could hear Richard taking off his glasses, a habit he had when he was trying to process something illogical. "Wallace," he said slowly, "you just bought a pristine home for your son. Why would you buy a garbage dump next door? You are 72 years old. You should be playing golf, not fighting dry rot." "I am not buying it to live in, Richard," I replied, my eyes fixed on the window of my son's house where I could just make out the silhouette of Dorothy moving around the kitchen. "I am buying it because I need a front row seat. And I need you to make sure my name appears nowhere on the deed. When the sale goes through tomorrow, I want the owner listed strictly as Phoenix Holdings." I could hear the gears turning in his head. He knew about the text message. He knew about the check I had torn up. Richard was a smart man. He put two and two together and realized I was about to start a war. "All right," he said, his tone shifting from lawyer to accomplice. "I will draw up the offer. Cash talks. With no inspection, the bank will trip over themselves to sign it over by noon tomorrow. But Wallace, are you sure about this?" I started the engine of my truck, a grim smile finally touching my lips. I have never been more sure of anything in my life. "Get it done, Richard." I pulled away from the curb, leaving the pristine mansion and the rotting foreclosure behind me. They wanted distance. They wanted boundaries. I was about to give them a neighbor who respected neither. By this time tomorrow, I would not just be the father they pushed away. I would be the landlord of the nightmare next door. The following afternoon, the weather was perfect for a social execution. The sun was shining brightly on the manicured lawn of my son's house, illuminating the scene Dorothy had so carefully staged. From the elevated cab of my truck, parked just down the street, I watched as the ladies of the Lake Garden Club arrived in their luxury sedans. Dorothy was in her element. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a floral dress that probably cost more than my first car. She moved among the tables she had set up on the patio, pointing out the landscaping and accepting compliments for a home she did not own and a garden she had not planted. I could see the crystal glasses sparkling and the silver-tiered trays filled with expensive pastries. It was a picture of suburban royalty, and Dorothy was the self-appointed queen holding court. She had no idea that the peasants were about to revolt. I picked up the two-way radio on my dashboard and pressed the button. It was time. "Send them in, Hank," I said calmly. "Make it loud." "Roger that, boss," came the crackling reply. At first the guests didn't notice. They were too busy sipping Earl Grey and discussing the property values. But then the coffee in their cups began to ripple. A low vibration started in the ground, a rumble that grew steadily in intensity until it felt less like traffic and more like an approaching earthquake. The polite conversation on the patio faltered. Dorothy froze a porcelain teacup halfway to her lips, her eyes darting toward the street. That was when the first beast turned the corner. It was a 10-wheel dump truck, its diesel engine roaring like a jet plane taking off. But it wasn't alone. Behind it came a second, then a third, until a convoy of 5 massive heavy-duty construction vehicles filled the narrow suburban street. They didn't just drive past. With the synchronized precision of a military operation, the convoy slowed and began to reverse into the driveway of the foreclosure next door. The sound was deafening. The piercing beep, beep, beep of the backup alarms cut through the afternoon air, drowning out the classical music Dorothy had playing on her portable speakers. The women covered their ears, their faces twisting in confusion and horror. But the noise was just the opening act. As the first truck reached the property line mere feet from where Dorothy was entertaining the town elite, the hydraulic lift engaged. With a mechanical groan, the bed of the truck rose. Thousands of pounds of dry gravel, dirt, and construction debris cascaded out onto the parched earth of my new property. The impact created a shockwave, but more importantly, it created a cloud. A massive billowing plume of fine brown dust rose into the air. Caught by the gentle afternoon breeze, the cloud did not dissipate. Instead, it drifted lazily, inexorably right over the fence. It moved like a beige tsunami rolling over the pristine white tablecloths, settling on the expensive pastries and coating the freshly washed hair of the garden club members. I watched as Dorothy screamed a sound, completely swallowed by the roar of the second truck dumping its load. She waved her hands frantically, trying to shoo away the dust, as if it were a fly, but nature does not negotiate. Within seconds, her elegant tea party looked like an archaeological dig site. The pristine illusion she had fought so hard to maintain was literally crumbling under the weight of my first renovation decision. I sat back in my seat, took a sip of my lukewarm coffee, and watched the chaos unfold. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The dust from the gravel drop had barely begun to settle when the invasion began. From my vantage point, leaning against the grill of the lead dump truck, I watched Dorothy stomp across the property line. She had abandoned her tea party guests and was marching through the knee-high weeds in her designer heels, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I adjusted my yellow hard hat low over my eyes and pulled my dust gaiter up to cover my nose and mouth. To her, I was just a faceless laborer, a grunt in a neon vest who had dared to disrupt her afternoon. She did not see a millionaire contractor. She saw a target. She reached the driveway breathless and shrieking, waving a frantic hand at the cloud of dirt still drifting over her fence. "You morons!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Look at what you have done. My patio is ruined. Who is in charge here? I want to speak to the manager right now." I did not move. I simply crossed my arms over my chest and stared at her. My silence only fueled her fire. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, her finger jabbing the air inches from my safety vest. "Are you deaf?" she spat. "I said I want your boss. I am going to have this entire operation shut down. Do you know who I am? My son-in-law owns the estate next door. We are personal friends with the mayor. You and your little crew of dirt pushers will be unemployed by sunset." I stayed silent, letting her dig the hole deeper. She looked me up and down with a sneer of absolute disgust. The way she looked at my work boots caked in mud and my weathered hands told me everything I needed to know about how she viewed the working class. "You are pathetic," she hissed, stepping onto the fresh gravel I had just laid down. "I bet you cannot even speak English. Just get me someone who matters. Get me the owner of this dump before I call the police and have you dragged away for vandalism." That was the cue. She wanted the owner. She wanted someone who mattered. I reached up slowly, deliberately. I unclipped the chin strap of my hard hat and pulled it off, letting my gray hair catch the afternoon breeze. Then I pulled down the dust mask. The silence that fell over the construction site was heavier than the trucks behind me. Dorothy froze. Her mouth, which had been open to deliver another insult, stayed open, but the sound died in her throat. Her eyes bulged. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear a hallucination. She looked from my face to the house next door, then back to me, her brain short-circuiting as it tried to reconcile the filthy laborer with the man who paid her daughter's bills. Wallace, she whispered, the color draining from her face so fast she looked like a ghost. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be—" I did not let her finish. I did not smile. I did not offer a greeting. I stepped forward, forcing her to take a stumbling step back onto the uneven ground. "Mrs. Miller," I said, my voice low and devoid of any warmth. "You are currently standing in a designated hard hat zone without approved safety equipment." "But why did you buy—" she stammered, pointing at the rotting porch. I cut her off again, my voice rising just enough to be heard over the idling diesel engines. "This is an active construction site with heavy machinery in motion. Per OSHA regulations and state property laws, this area is restricted to employees and owners only." I pointed a calloused finger toward the property line, toward the party she had tried to exclude me from. "You are trespassing, Dorothy. I suggest you return to your side of the fence before I call the authorities and have you cited. Now, move." She stood there for one more second, paralyzed by the shock of the power shift. Then, as Hank revved the engine of the excavator behind me, she turned and fled, stumbling back through the weeds, fleeing from the man she thought she had discarded. She wanted a boundary. I had just drawn a line in the dirt. My son Brian and his wife Brittany were not usually morning people, nor were they particularly fast on their feet. But the sight of Dorothy fleeing in terror seemed to have given them a sudden burst of speed. They came running from the back of the house, Brittany still holding a half-eaten macaron, and Brian looking like a deer caught in headlights. They stopped short at the property line, staring at me as if I were a ghost. I stood there, still holding my hard hat, the dust settling on my shoulders like a mantle of war. Dad Brian choked out his voice, a mix of confusion and fear. "What is going on, Mom? I mean Dorothy. Just ran inside crying. And why are you wearing that vest?" I took a slow, deliberate step toward the fence. I did not look at Brittany. I looked straight at my son. The son whose mortgage I had paid. The son who had allowed his wife to uninvite me from Thanksgiving via text message. "I am wearing this vest, Brian, because safety comes first on a demolition site." I said, my voice calm and steady. "And as for what is going on, I thought it was obvious. I am improving the neighborhood." Brittany stepped forward, her face flushed. "Improving it? You are ruining it. Look at this dust. Look at these trucks. You cannot just come here and start dumping dirt next to our house. We have rights. We have an HOA." I let out a short, dry laugh. "Ah, yes. The HOA. I read the bylaws last night, Brittany. Section 4, paragraph 2 states that construction is permitted between the hours of 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. As for your rights, they end exactly where this property line begins." Brian looked from me to the rotting house behind me. "But Dad, you bought this place." "Why?" "It is a teardown. It is going to take months to fix up." 6 months, actually, I corrected him, checking my watch. "Maybe 7 if we run into issues with the foundation. And yes, it will be loud. Jackhammers usually are. I imagine the vibration might be a bit disruptive to your morning yoga sessions, Brittany. And the dust. Well, I am afraid you might want to keep those windows closed until spring." Brittany's mouth dropped open. "You are doing this on purpose," she screeched. "You are doing this because of the Thanksgiving thing." I looked at her, then really looked at her. I saw the entitlement, the selfishness, the complete lack of gratitude, and I felt absolutely nothing. I am doing this, Brittany, because I needed a project, I said, my voice dropping an octave. Retirement was getting boring, and since I suddenly found myself with a lot of free time during the holidays, I thought I would get a head start. I put my hard hat back on and clipped the strap under my chin. Now, if you will excuse me, gentlemen, I have a crew to supervise. We start the heavy demolition tomorrow at dawn. I suggest you invest in some earplugs. I turned my back on them before they could say another word. As I walked back toward the excavator, I heard Brittany burst into tears and Brian trying to comfort her. But for the first time in years, their drama was not my problem. It was just background noise to the beautiful sound of a diesel engine revving up. The war had officially begun, and I had just fired the first shot. The sun had not even fully crested the horizon when I took my position on the rotting porch of the foreclosure. My watch read 5:59 in the morning. To most people in this manicured subdivision, this was an ungodly hour, a time for deep sleep under Egyptian cotton sheets. To a general contractor who had built half the commercial district in this county, it was the starting line. I held a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and a laminated copy of the Municipal Noise Ordinance in the other. Section 4, Paragraph 2 clearly stated that heavy construction noise was permitted in residential zones starting at exactly 600 hours, not a minute sooner. And I was a man who respected the law down to the second. I looked at Hank, my foreman, who was standing by the industrial-grade pneumatic jackhammer. He had a pair of heavy-duty ear defenders on and a mischievous glint in his eye. He looked at me, waiting for the signal. I watched the second hand on my watch sweep past the 12. I nodded once. The sound that followed was not just noise. It was a physical assault on the senses. The rhythmic, bone-rattling percussion of the jackhammer, tearing into the concrete driveway, echoed off the vinyl siding of my son's house like machine gun fire. It was a symphony of destruction, loud enough to wake the dead, and certainly loud enough to wake the entitled. Through the large bay window of the mansion next door, I had a perfect view of the living room. Dorothy was there, sitting cross-legged on an expensive purple yoga mat, surrounded by what looked like healing crystals. She was trying to meditate, likely manifesting abundance or some other nonsense she posted about online. When the drill hit the concrete, she did not just jump, she practically levitated. Her zen was obliterated instantly. She scrambled up, clutching her chest, looking around wildly as if the house were under aerial bombardment. The peaceful morning aura she tried so hard to cultivate was shattered by 90 decibels of reality. But the real show was upstairs. The master bedroom curtains were ripped open with such force I thought they might come off the rod. Brittany appeared at the window. She looked nothing like the polished, filtered influencer she pretended to be on social media. Her hair was a tangled bird's nest, her silk sleep mask was hanging off one ear, and she was screaming. I could not hear her, of course. The beautiful roar of demolition drowned out everything. She threw the window sash up, leaning out to scream at me, her face contorted in fury. I could read her lips perfectly. She was yelling about her sleep schedule. She was yelling that she had to film a "Get Ready With Me" video at 9 and she needed her beauty rest. She was yelling that I was a monster. I did not yell back. I did not engage in a shouting match that I would surely lose to her high-pitched shrieking. Instead, I simply raised my coffee mug in a silent, cheerful toast. I pointed to my wrist, tapping the face of my watch. It was 6:05. I was perfectly within my rights. Seeing them so rattled, so powerless against the very rules they usually use to control others was deeply satisfying. They wanted me to keep my distance. They wanted me out of their house. Well, I was out. I was right next door, and I was making sure that every single second of their day started with a reminder that Wallace Prentice was not a man to be trifled with. As Dorothy paced the living room covering her ears, and Brittany slammed the window shut, in a futile attempt to block out the noise, I took a slow sip of coffee. It was going to be a very productive day. The jackhammers fell silent for a mid-morning break, leaving a ringing in the air, that was almost louder than the noise itself. That was when I saw him. My son Brian was navigating his way through the piles of debris and torn-up earth that now separated our properties. He did not walk with the stride of a man who owned a $2 million estate. He walked with the hunched shoulders of a beaten dog. He looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red, casting nervous glances back toward his own house as if he were escaping a prison camp rather than visiting his father. I wiped the grease from my hands onto a rag and waited for him to reach the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, refusing to make eye contact. "Dad." "Please," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You have to stop this. Brittany is having a meltdown. She cannot record her content. She is crying in the bathroom. Dorothy is threatening to call the city council. You made your point, okay? Please just pack up the trucks." I looked at my son. I looked at the soft hands that had never known a day of hard labor, because I had worked myself to the bone to ensure he would never have to. I felt a flicker of the old instinct, the urge to fix it, to smooth the path for him. But then I remembered the text message. I remembered the torn check. "It is a construction site, Brian," I said, leaning back against the railing. "Construction is loud. Progress is messy. If your wife is stressed, perhaps she should invest in noise-canceling headphones." Brian ran a hand through his hair, looking desperate. "It is not just the noise, Dad. It is everything. The dust, the workers, the stress. We are trying to build a life here." "You're trying to build a fantasy," I corrected him. "And speaking of building fantasies, Brian, while you are standing there begging me to save your peace of mind, perhaps you can explain the notification I got this morning." He froze. His eyes finally met mine, wide with panic. "What notification?" he asked, his voice trembling. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. Because I had co-signed on his primary credit line back when he was in college, the bank still sent me alerts for unusual activity. $30,000, Brian, I said, reading the screen. A single transaction posted yesterday at an upscale boutique downtown. Now, seeing as I paid for your house, and I know your salary as an IT support specialist brings in maybe $6,000 a month, I am curious. How exactly do you plan to pay for that? He swallowed hard, shifting his weight. It was an investment. For Brittany's brand. We need to look successful to attract sponsors. Do not lie to me, I said, my voice cutting through his excuses like a saw. I called the store Brian. They know me. I built their showroom. I asked what you bought. It was a handbag. A Birkin. He looked down at his shoes, his face burning crimson. And here is the part that breaks my heart, son. I continued, my voice softening into a dangerous calm. You did not buy it for your wife. You bought it for Dorothy. You spent $30,000 of money. You do not have to buy a purse for a woman who despises you, a woman who convinced your wife to kick your own father out of Thanksgiving. Brian slumped against the porch railing, defeated. She said if I got it for her, she would stop complaining about the house. She said she would be nice to me. I just wanted some peace, Dad. I shook my head, looking at the man-child standing before me. You cannot buy peace from a tyrant, Brian. You can only pay tribute. And I am done subsidizing your tributes. You are on your own with that debt. Now get off my job site. The break is over and the jackhammers are about to start again. I signaled to Hank, and the deafening roar of the machines started up, instantly drowning out whatever excuse my son tried to stammer next. He turned and walked back toward his mansion, a man drowning in debt and delusion, while I went back to work, building the only thing that mattered anymore, my own dignity. The arrival of a police cruiser at a construction site usually signals a serious accident or a permit violation. But when I saw the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the side of my excavator just after lunch, I knew exactly who had summoned them. Dorothy was standing at the edge of her driveway, wearing oversized sunglasses and clutching a silk robe around herself as if she were a victim in a noir film. She was pointing an accusatory finger at the high-definition security cameras I had mounted on the perimeter poles of my property that morning. To a layman, they looked like military-grade surveillance equipment. To me, they were standard insurance requirements for a site with heavy machinery. To Dorothy, they were the eyes of a predator. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked toward the gate to meet the officer. It was Officer Miller, a good man I had known since I built the precinct's extension 5 years ago. He looked tired, the look of a man who had better things to do than referee a suburban dispute. "Afternoon, Wallace," he said, tipping his cap. "We got a call about a peeping Tom. A frantic report claiming you are using electronic devices to film into the private bedrooms of the residents next door." I looked past him to Dorothy, who was practically vibrating with self-righteous indignation. "He is watching us," she shrieked, her voice shrill enough to crack glass. I saw the lens move. "He is filming my daughter while she sunbathes. He is filming me in my kitchen. It is a violation of my civil rights. I want him arrested and those cameras torn down immediately." I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice. I simply gestured for Officer Miller to follow me to the temporary site office, a small trailer I had set up near the road. "Officer," I said, opening the door. "I take privacy laws very seriously. In fact, I helped draft the guidelines for construction site security in this township. Would you like to see the feed?" Dorothy tried to push her way in, but Officer Miller held up a hand. "You stay here, ma'am." Inside the trailer, I woke up the large monitor on the wall. The screen displayed a grid of 4 camera feeds. The image quality was crystal clear. You could see every pebble of gravel on my lot. You could see the rusted nails on the porch of the foreclosure. But what you could not see was anything happening next door. I pointed to the black bars on the screen. "These are digital privacy masks, officer. I programmed them myself this morning. As you can see, the software automatically blacks out any area beyond my property line. The camera physically cannot record what is happening in their yard or their windows. It is a solid black box." Officer Miller leaned in, inspecting the screen. He watched as a bird flew across the frame. The moment it crossed the fence line into Dorothy's yard, it disappeared into the black void of the privacy mask. "So you are filming nothing but your own dirt?" Miller asked, a small smile playing on his lips. "Strictly my own dirt," I confirmed. "I have no interest in what happens in that house, officer. My only concern is protecting my equipment from vandals." Miller nodded and walked back outside. Dorothy was waiting, a smug look on her face, expecting to see me in handcuffs. "Well," she demanded. "Did you smash the cameras?" ma'am, Officer Miller said, his voice stern. "Mr. Prentice is in full compliance with the law. His cameras are blocked from seeing your property. In fact, they are programmed to ignore you completely." Dorothy's jaw dropped. "That is a lie. He rigged it." "I suggest you stop calling 911 for non-emergencies," Miller warned, getting back into his cruiser. "If you call us out here again because you do not like your neighbor, I will be writing you a ticket for wasting police resources. Have a nice day." I stood in the doorway of my trailer and watched Dorothy deflate. She looked at the cameras, then at me. For the first time, she realized that the only person obsessed with watching the other was her. I did not even care enough to spy on them. To me, they were just a blank black box on a screen, irrelevant and unseen. And that indifference hurt her more than any invasion of privacy ever could. The jackhammers took a break the following Tuesday, but the silence was even more dangerous for my neighbors. I had traded my demolition crew for a survey team. 2 men in high-visibility orange vests were moving methodically across the overgrown lawn of my property, setting up tripods and laser sights. They were looking for the original iron pins driven into the earth back in the 1950s. I stood by the property line holding a set of blueprints, watching Dorothy pace back and forth on her patio like a caged tiger. She was on the phone, likely complaining to Brian or the HOA president, casting nasty glares in my direction. She probably thought I was preparing to build a fence to block her view. She was half right. I was preparing to define boundaries, but not the kind she expected. The head surveyor, a man named Mike who had marked out half the subdivisions in Chicago, waved me over. He was standing near the edge of the driveway, right next to the magnificent wall of thuja green giant arborvitae trees that Dorothy had planted shortly after moving in. These were not cheap shrubs. They were 12-foot-tall manicured evergreens that formed a dense, lush barrier between our worlds. Dorothy called it her privacy wall. She bragged to the neighbors that she had imported them from a specialized nursery in Oregon for $2,000 apiece. We found the pin, Wallace Mike said, pointing to a small patch of dirt he had cleared away at the base of the first tree. It was buried under about 3 inches of expensive red mulch. I looked down. There it was. The rusted iron head of the survey pin, the indisputable legal definition of where my land began and hers ended. Mike took a can of neon pink spray paint and marked the spot. Then he instructed his partner to take the prism pole to the back of the lot where the second pin was located. They pulled a bright pink nylon string tight between the 2 points to create a visual representation of the property line. The string did not run alongside the trees. It ran directly through them. I let out a low whistle. It looked like the trunk of every single tree in that $20,000 hedge was sitting exactly 6 inches or 15 centimeters over the line. They were planted on my dirt. Dorothy must have sensed something was wrong, because she hung up her phone and stormed over her heels, clicking on the pavers. "What are you doing now?" she demanded, eyeing the pink string. "Why are you painting graffiti on my landscaping?" "Hello, Dorothy," I said, my voice deceptively pleasant. "I am just updating my survey. And we seem to have discovered a problem. It appears that when you planted this lovely green wall to keep me out, you were a little too eager. You planted it on my land." She laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Do not be ridiculous. That is my yard. We measured it ourselves. You measured it with a tape measure, Dorothy. I measured it with a satellite-calibrated laser," I corrected her. "According to the deed and the iron pins, your trees are trespassing. 15 centimeters might not seem like much to you, but in real estate law, it is an invasion." "So what?" she scoffed, crossing her arms. "You are going to sue me over 6 inches of dirt, grow up, Wallace. The trees stay. They are worth more than your entire life." I looked at the pink string cutting into the bark of the cedar. I looked at the smug satisfaction on her face. She thought her wealth and her arrogance could override the laws of physics and property. "I am not going to sue you, Dorothy," I said, rolling up the blueprints. "I am a reasonable man, but I cannot allow a permanent structure to remain on my land. It creates a liability issue. If one of these trees falls and hits someone, I could be sued. So the encroachment has to be removed." I turned to Mike. "Mark them all." As Dorothy watched in horror, Mike walked down the line, spraying a bright pink X on the trunk of every single one of her precious, expensive trees. She did not know it yet, but she had just given me the legal right to do some gardening. And unlike her, I did not have a green thumb. I had a chainsaw. The beauty of a hydraulic excavator is that it does not negotiate. It does not feel pity, and it certainly does not care about the price tag of imported landscaping. I sat in the cab of the Caterpillar 320, the controls resting comfortably in my hands. Below me, the row of 12-foot arborvitae trees stood marked with the neon pink crosses of death. Dorothy was standing on her patio, her phone pressed to her ear, likely screaming at a lawyer who was about to tell her that she had no case. When I engaged the throttle and the diesel engine roared to life, she dropped the phone. She ran toward the property line, her arms waving frantically, looking like a woman trying to stop a tidal wave with a cocktail napkin. I did not stop. I did not even slow down. I swung the boom around the metal bucket, hovering ominously over the first tree in the line. I could see Dorothy shouting, her mouth forming the words, "Stop it, you maniac!" But I was legally clearing an encroachment on my land. I lowered the boom. The metal teeth of the bucket bit into the soft earth at the base of the tree. With a gentle pull on the joystick, I applied thousands of pounds of force. The sound was satisfyingly violent. The roots snapped with a noise like gunshots popping out of the ground as the massive tree was ripped from the earth as easily as a weed. I swung the arm and dropped the expensive shrub onto a pile of debris on my side of the line. 1 down, 20 to go. Dorothy fell to her knees sobbing as if I were executing hostages. But I kept going. Rip, swing, drop. Rip, swing, drop. It took me less than 15 minutes to dismantle the green wall she had spent thousands of dollars and years cultivating. The barrier between us was gone. And that was when the true punishment began. Because without that dense wall of greenery, the reality of my son's life was suddenly exposed to the entire world. For years, Dorothy and Brittany had presented an image of perfection. But as the last tree fell, the curtain was pulled back. Behind the manicured facade of the front yard, the backyard was a disaster zone. Without the trees to hide it, the street could now see the piles of garbage bags that Brian had been too lazy to haul to the curb. They could see the mountain of empty Amazon boxes rotting in the rain. They could see the algae-filled swimming pool that had turned a neon swamp green because they were too cheap to pay for maintenance. And worst of all, they could see the dog waste scattered everywhere, turning the lawn into a minefield. A car drove by slowly, the driver slowing down to gawk at the squalor that had been hidden behind the hedge. I saw Brittany run out the back door, freezing, when she realized she was on display. She looked at the street, then at the missing trees, and then at the pile of trash she was standing next to. The shame on her face was worth every gallon of diesel fuel I had burned. I cut the engine and opened the cab door, looking down at Dorothy, who was still weeping over a pile of roots. "I told you, Dorothy," I called out, my voice echoing in the sudden silence. "I am a stickler for property lines. But look on the bright side. Now you have a much better view of my progress." She looked up at me with hatred in her eyes, but she said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The fortress had fallen, and the queens of the castle were standing in their own filth. The dust from the excavation had barely settled when Richard pulled his pristine sedan into the muddy lot, parking carefully between 2 stacks of lumber. My lawyer looked out of place on a construction site, dressed in his charcoal suit and Italian loafers, but the grin on his face was dirtier than my work boots. He was not carrying blueprints or injunctions this time. He was carrying a thick manila envelope that looked heavy with secrets. I wiped my hands on my jeans and met him at the door of the site trailer, the smell of stale coffee and diesel fumes greeting us as we stepped inside, away from the noise of the idling bulldozers. Richard tossed the folder onto the folding table with a dull thud. He sat down on a metal chair, looking like a cat that had just swallowed a particularly fat canary. "You were right, Wallace," he said, loosening his tie. "She is not just a nightmare. She is a fraud." I picked up the envelope. I had asked Richard to run a comprehensive background check on Dorothy the day after she had me uninvited from Thanksgiving. I wanted to know exactly who I was fighting. I expected to find a divorce settlement, or perhaps a minor lawsuit. What I found was a financial autopsy of a life built entirely on lies. I slid the documents out. The first page was a credit report that looked like a crime scene. Red ink was everywhere. Dorothy Miller, the woman who turned up her nose at my work clothes and lectured me on property values, had a credit score lower than my blood pressure. She was drowning in debt. There were 5 maxed-out credit cards, all from high-end department stores, totaling over $80,000. But the real gem was on the second page. I had always wondered how a woman who claimed to be a retired interior designer could afford the white Mercedes G-Wagon she parked so arrogantly in my son's garage. The answer was simple. She couldn't. The vehicle was not owned. It was not even a standard lease. It was a predatory, high-interest, long-term rental from a shady dealership in the city, and she was 3 months behind on payments. The repossession order had been issued 2 weeks ago. She was hiding the car in Brian's garage, not to save the paint, but to hide it from the tow truck drivers scanning license plates. I kept reading. Her previous address was not a stately manor, as she had implied to the neighbors. It was a rented condo in a mid-range complex from which she had been evicted 6 months ago for non-payment of rent. That timeline lined up perfectly with when she suddenly decided to move in with Brian and Brittany to help them settle in. She had not moved in out of maternal love. She had moved in because she was homeless. I looked up at Richard. He was watching me read, enjoying the realization dawning on my face. "She is broke," I said quietly. "She has absolutely nothing." "It is worse than that," Richard replied. "She is a parasite, Wallace. She needs your son's income to survive. That is why she hates you. You are the one person who holds the purse strings, the one person who can see through the facade. She pushed you out because she needs total control over Brian's finances to pay off her own disasters." I looked out the dusty window of the trailer toward the mansion next door. Through the gap where the trees used to be, I could see Dorothy on the patio sipping wine that my son had likely paid for. Suddenly, she did not look like a formidable opponent anymore. She looked like a desperate grifter clinging to a life raft. She had treated me like I was beneath her, all while living on a house of cards that was one gust of wind away from collapsing, and I was the hurricane. I closed the folder and tapped it against the table. The game had just changed. I was no longer just fighting for respect. I was fighting to save my son from being bled dry by a woman who saw him as nothing more than an ATM with a pulse. I put the file in my safe and locked it. It was not time to use this ammunition yet. I would save it for the main event. The smell hit me before I even reached the trench. It was a thick, cloying stench that had no place on a clean excavation site, the unmistakable odor of raw sewage mixed with the chemical tang of chlorine. Hank, my foreman, was standing waist-deep in a hole we had just dug to access the main utility line. He was holding a shovel in one hand and pinching his nose with the other. He looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and professional disgust. "Boss, you are going to want to see this," Hank shouted over the rumble of the idling excavator. "We found something that is definitely not on the city blueprints." I slid down the muddy embankment, my boots finding purchase in the clay. When I peered into the hole, I saw exactly what had offended Hank's nose. Jutting out from the side of the trench, crossing from my son's property into mine, was a 3-inch PVC pipe. It was not the heavy-duty Schedule 40 pipe required by code. It was the cheap, thin plastic used for sprinkler systems. And it was leaking. Dark, soapy water was seeping out of a joint that had been sealed not with primer and glue, but with what looked like duct tape and silicone caulk. I traced the line of the pipe visually. It ran straight back toward the rear deck of Brian's house, directly underneath the brand-new 6-person jacuzzi that Dorothy had installed last week. I remembered seeing the delivery truck. I remembered hearing her brag to a neighbor that she had found a contractor who could install it for half the price of the quotes Brian had received. Now I knew how she got that discount. "That is a bootleg tie-in," Hank said, shaking his head. "They bypassed the septic tank and ran the hot tub discharge straight into the storm drain field. But they missed the drain, Wallace. They are dumping gray water and sewage right into the soil." I crouched down to get a closer look. It was worse than just a bad connection. It was a ticking time bomb. The angle of the pipe was wrong. There was no backflow preventer. That meant that if the pressure in the main line ever increased, or if there was a heavy blockage, the sewage would not flow out. It would flow back in. Hank reached for his radio. "Should I call the city inspectors? This is a massive code violation. They will shut their water off tonight." I reached out and lowered his hand. "No," I said softly. "Not yet." Hank looked at me surprised. "But Wallace, if that pipe bursts, it is going to be a mess." "Exactly," I said, pulling out my phone. I snapped a series of high-resolution photos of the illegal connection, making sure to capture the date, the time, and the clear trajectory leading back to Dorothy's prized hot tub. I documented the cracks in the cheap plastic. I documented the leak. "If we call the inspector now," I explained, "stepping out of the trench, they get a fine. They pay a few $100s, they fix it, and they move on. But look at that tape, Hank. Look at the pressure building up in that line every time she turns those jets on. That pipe is not going to last another week. I looked up at the deck. I could see the steam rising from the hot tub. Dorothy was probably soaking in it right now, sipping wine, oblivious to the fact that she was sitting on top of a geyser of her own filth. "Cover it up," I ordered. "Put a steel plate over our side so it does not leak onto my sight, but leave their pipe exactly as it is." But Boss Hank stammered. "I said leave it," I commanded, climbing back up to solid ground. "When that thing blows, I want it to be a surprise. I have the photos to prove I did not touch it. Whatever happens next is simply the consequence of hiring the lowest bidder." I walked away, leaving the illegal pipe buried in the dark, ticking away like a countdown clock, waiting for the perfect moment to explode. Dorothy wanted a spa experience. She was about to get a mud bath. I barely had time to finish my morning site inspection before the next wave of absurdity crashed against my fence line. This time they did not bring insults or tears. They brought paperwork, or at least what they thought passed for paperwork. I saw Brittany marching across the trampled grass, where the arborvitae used to be, holding a crisp white envelope like it was a weapon. Dorothy was right behind her, whispering in her ear, coaching her like a boxing manager sending a fighter into the ring to get slaughtered. I leaned on my shovel and waited. I had faced union disputes, city inspectors, and federal audits. Two women with a Google search history of legal terms did not exactly make my knees shake. "Daddy, we need to talk," Brittany said, her voice shaking slightly as she thrust the envelope toward me. "This is a formal notice. If you do not cease and desist all construction activity immediately and pay for the restoration of the trees you destroyed, we are filing a lawsuit." I wiped my hands on my jeans and took the envelope. I did not open it. I could feel the weight of the cheap printer paper inside. A lawsuit? I repeated, looking from her to Dorothy. On what grounds, exactly? "Intentional infliction of emotional distress," Dorothy piped up, stepping out from behind her daughter. She crossed her arms, looking smug. "You are creating a hostile living environment, Wallace. The noise, the dust, the humiliation. It is affecting Brittany's mental health. She cannot work. She cannot sleep. My lawyer says we have a multi-million-dollar case." I almost laughed. I knew for a fact that Dorothy's lawyer was likely a court-appointed public defender from her eviction case, or worse, an imaginary friend. Real lawyers do not advise clients to sue the man paying their mortgage. I looked at Brittany. She looked tired, caught between a mother who demanded obedience and a father-in-law who held the keys to her lifestyle. "Brittany," I said softly, "do you know how much a retainer costs for a civil litigation attorney in this county?" She blinked, confused by the question. I do not know," Mom said. "It is $10,000 just to get them to open a file," I interrupted. "And that is for a bad one. My attorney Richard charges $600 an hour. And do you know what the difference is between us?" I took a step closer to the property line, lowering my voice so only they could hear. "I can keep Richard on the payroll for the next 20 years without blinking. I have a war chest set aside specifically for legal fees that is larger than the entire value of your house. But you two, you are struggling to pay the minimum balance on your credit cards." Dorothy's face turned a shade of purple that clashed with her silk robe. "How dare you?" she sputtered. "You do not know anything about our finances." "I know everything, Dorothy," I said, my voice hardening. "I know about the car rental. I know about the eviction. And I know that if you try to sue me, I will bury you in so much paperwork and so many counterclaims that you will be bankrupt before you even step foot in a courtroom. So go ahead. Sue me. My legal budget is bigger than your inheritance. In fact, at the rate you are annoying me, it is the only inheritance you are going to get." Brittany looked at her mother, then back at me, the blood draining from her face. She realized in that moment that I was not just an old man with a shovel. I was a fortress they could not breach. "Take your letter back," I said, tucking the envelope into Brittany's hand. "You can use the back of it to make a budget. You are going to need one." I turned around and signaled the excavator operator to fire up the engine. As the diesel roar filled the air, drowning out Dorothy's impotent screaming, I walked away. They threatened me with a paper tiger. I threatened them with reality. And in my experience, reality always wins. The following Friday, I changed my tactics. I silenced the jackhammers and sent the heavy machinery to the back of the lot. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood was quiet. Dorothy and Brittany likely thought they had won, that perhaps their legal threat had actually scared me. They could not have been more wrong. I had simply moved from the demolition phase to the design phase, and in my world, design is a spectator sport for the elite. I set up a large, pristine white event tent right in the middle of the graded dirt, contrasting sharply with the raw earth. I laid down red carpet over the plywood walkways. Then I made 5 phone calls. In my 40 years of business, I had built more than just office complexes. I had built favors. I had built relationships with the men and women who ran this city. And it was time to cash those chips in. Around noon, the parade began. But unlike the dump trucks that had terrorized Dorothy earlier, these vehicles were silent and expensive. A black Bentley rolled up to the curb, followed by a vintage Jaguar and 2 Teslas. Out stepped the mayor of Barrington, a man whose campaign I had largely funded. Behind him was the chief of surgery at the regional hospital and the 2 wealthiest real estate developers in the state. These were the people Dorothy spent her entire life trying to impress. These were the social circles she pretended to be part of but was never actually invited to. I greeted them at the edge of the property, wearing a tailored Italian suit that cost more than Dorothy's rental car. We popped a bottle of Dom Perignon, pouring it into crystal flutes while standing amidst the construction debris. I unrolled the architectural renderings for what I was actually planning to build. I wasn't just fixing up a house. I was creating a masterpiece of modern, sustainable architecture, a legacy project that would be featured in Architectural Digest. From the corner of my eye, I saw the curtains in my son's house twitch. Then the sliding glass door opened. Dorothy stepped out. She had clearly rushed to put on her best dress and fix her hair. She saw the mayor. She saw the developers. I could practically smell her desperation from 50 feet away. She started walking toward the fence line, holding a tray of store-bought cookies, wearing a smile so fake it looked painful. She was coming to crash the party. She was coming to network. "Wallace," she called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I see you have company. I just wanted to bring over a little housewarming treat." The mayor stopped talking and looked at her. The developers looked at her. I did not turn around. I kept my back to her, pointing at a detail on the blueprints. "Ignore the noise, gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the silence. "It is just the help from next door." The mayor chuckled and turned his back on her. The developers followed suit. We formed a closed circle, a wall of expensive suits and influence that completely shut her out. Dorothy stood there, freezing in her tracks, holding her tray of cookies. She had been rendered invisible. The most powerful people in town were standing on a patch of dirt next to her, and not one of them acknowledged her existence. I saw her lip tremble. Being hated is one thing. Being irrelevant is far worse for a narcissist. She stood there for a long, agonizing minute, waiting for anyone to look at her. When nobody did, she turned around and walked back into her house, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen her. I took a sip of champagne. The jackhammers hurt her ears, but this hurt her soul. And I was just getting started. The exhaust fumes from the mayor's Bentley had barely dissipated when the inevitable happened. My phone vibrated on the folding table inside the site trailer. I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. Social climbers like my daughter-in-law have a 6th sense for power, and seeing the city's political elite sipping champagne on a pile of dirt next to her house had triggered her survival instincts. I picked up the phone. The text message from Brittany was a masterclass in gaslighting. It read, "Hi Wallace. It looked like you were having a busy afternoon. We were talking, and we realized it would be a shame for you to be alone on the holiday. We still want to keep dinner intimate for my mom, but maybe you could swing by around 8 for dessert. We will save you a slice of pumpkin pie. I stared at the words, feeling a cold smile spread across my face. Dessert. She was offering me the scraps. She was offering me a 30-minute window to sit in the corner and eat a slice of store-bought pie just so she could tell her friends she was a benevolent daughter-in-law. She wanted to bridge the gap, not because she loved me, but because she had just realized that the man she kicked to the curb had the mayor on speed dial. She wanted access, not reconciliation. I did not type a reply. I did not give her the satisfaction of a digital footprint she could screenshot and show to her friends to make herself look like the victim. Instead, I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out a stack of heavy cream-colored cardstock. These were custom-made invitations for my Thanksgiving gala embossed with gold leaf. I took a fountain pen, the heavy Mont Blanc I used for signing million-dollar contracts, and I wrote a single name on the envelope. Brian Prentice. I did not write Brian and family. I did not write Brian and Brittany. And I certainly did not write plus guest. I wrote my son's name and his name alone. I was drawing a line in the sand, forcing him to choose between the toxic women who controlled him and the father who had built his world. I walked out to the fence line, where Brian was pretending to rake leaves, casting nervous glances toward my trailer. He looked miserable. I whistled to get his attention. He looked up, startled. I did not say a word. I simply held the invitation over the fence and dropped it. It fluttered down landing on his perfectly manicured grass. "What is this, Dad?" he asked, walking over and picking it up. "It is an invitation, Brian," I said, my voice flat. "I am hosting a dinner. A real dinner. With people who actually matter in this town. Since you are so fond of immediate family only, I decided to adopt the same policy. You are my immediate family. Your wife and her mother are not." He stared at the envelope, then at me, his eyes widening as he realized what I was doing. "You expect me to come without them," he stammered. "Brittany will kill me." "Then die a man, Brian, instead of living as a servant," I replied. "Dinner is at 6, the dress code is black tie. And Brian, do not be late. The governor hates waiting." I turned and walked away before he could answer. I knew Brittany was watching from the window. I knew she saw the gold leaf envelope. And I knew that by inviting only her husband to the event of the season while leaving her to eat turkey with her bankrupt mother, I had just planted a grenade in the middle of their marriage. The text message about dessert remained unanswered. "I do not eat crumbs. I own the bakery." The sun rose on Thanksgiving morning, but the atmosphere on our street was divided into two distinct climate zones. On my side of the newly erected fence, the air was buzzing with the vibrant, cheerful energy of a high-end production. A team of event planners whom I had hired weeks ago was busy transforming the raw construction site into a venue that would rival any country club. A massive, pristine white marquee tent had been pitched in the center of the graded lot. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung from the silk-lined ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the round tables, set with fine china and sterling silver. The smell of roasting turkey infused with truffle butter and sage wafted from the mobile kitchen, where a Michelin-starred chef and his team were already hard at work. It was a symphony of excess, a deliberate display of the life I could provide. On the other side of the property line, things were decidedly less festive. Through the gaps in the fence, I could see the patio of my son's house. It was gray and lifeless. The expensive outdoor furniture was covered in a layer of construction dust that they had not bothered to clean. There were no decorations, no laughter, no music. The only sound coming from the house was the sharp, angry voice of Dorothy. She was pacing back and forth in the kitchen, her silhouette visible through the sliding glass door. She was holding a stack of bills in one hand and a phone in the other, likely screaming at a caterer who had canceled because her credit card had been declined. I walked over to the edge of my property, adjusting the cuffs of my tuxedo. I saw Brian come out onto his deck. He was wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, looking like a man walking to his own execution. He looked over at my tent at the waiters polishing glasses at the sheer scale of the celebration I was preparing. Then he looked back at his own house, where the only thing brewing was resentment. "Hey, Dad," he called out softly, his voice barely carrying over the distance. "It looks incredible over there." "It will be Brian," I said, not moving closer. "We are serving Wagyu beef alongside the turkey, and the wine list includes bottles older than you are." He swallowed hard, kicking at a loose stone on his patio. "Brittany is crying again. She burned the pie. And Dorothy says we cannot afford to order takeout from the good place. We are having rotisserie chicken from the grocery store." I felt a pang of pity, but I strangled it immediately. "Choices have consequences, Brian. You chose immediate family. Immediate family eats grocery store chicken. My guests eat like kings." I turned my back on him as a florist arrived with an armful of white orchids. I could feel his eyes on me, burning with regret. He was realizing that the grass was indeed greener on the other side, mostly because I had the money to water it, and he had allowed his mother-in-law to salt his earth. As the sun began to climb higher, the contrast became sharper. My side was a beacon of abundance and joy. His side was a shadow of debt and misery, and the day was only just beginning. The real fireworks were yet to come, and unlike the ones in the sky, these would leave a mark that no amount of apologizing could erase. 24 giờ trước khi con gà tây đầu tiên được đưa vào lò nướng, sự im lặng căng thẳng bên phía nhà con trai tôi đã bị phá vỡ, không phải bởi một lời xin lỗi mà bởi một tiếng nổ lớn. Âm thanh đó giống như một tiếng súng nổ bị bóp nghẹt dưới lòng đất theo sau, là tiếng rít chói tai của áp suất nước được giải phóng. Tôi đang ở trong lều tiếc của mình kiểm tra việc sắp xếp chỗ ngồi với người tổ chức sự kiện, thì mặt đất rung chuyển nhẹ dưới chân tôi. Tôi biết chính xác điều gì vừa xảy ra. Cái kết nối ống nước bất hợp pháp chấp vá bằng băng kẹo và hy vọng viển vông cuối cùng đã đầu hàng vật lý. Tôi bước ra khỏi lều và nhìn qua hàng rào. Sự hỗn loạn bên kia thật đáng xem. Nước không chỉ rò rỉ, nó đang phun trào. Một mạch nước ngầm đúc ngầu hôi thối đang sùi bọt lên từ bãi cỏ, ngay bên dưới sàn gỗ đắt tiền, nơi đất bồn tắm nước nóng. Nhưng điều tồi tệ hơn đang diễn ra bên dưới. Cánh cửa tầng hầm của nhà Brian bắt mở, và tôi có thể nghe thấy tiếng nước chảy ầm ầm như một thác nước trong nhà. Dorothy lao ra khỏi cửa sau chiếc váy lụa của bà ta, bay phấp phới trong cơn gió lạnh tháng 11. Bà ta không quan tâm đến việc nước đang phá hủy nền móng ngôi nhà. Mối quan tâm duy nhất của bà ta là sự bất tiện của chính mình. "Brian," bà ta gào lên, giọng nói vang vọng khắp khu phố. "Làm gì đó đi. Tầng hầm ngập hết rồi. Những cái hộp đổ hiệu của mẹ để dưới đó." Brian chạy ra ướt sũng từ đầu đến chân, tay cầm một cái xô nhựa vô dụng. Anh ta trông hoảng loạn tột độ. "Mẹ ơi, con không biết khóa van ở đâu. Nước mạnh quá." Đồ vô dụng, Dorothy hét lên, dàm chân xuống vũng bùn đang lan rộng. "Gọi thợ đi. Gọi ngay lập tức. Mẹ không thể sống trong cái chuồng lớn ngập nước này vào lễ tạ ơn." Tôi đứng yên bên phía mình cửa hàng rào, nhập một ngụm cà phê nóng. Tôi biết rõ vẫn khóa nước tống nằm ở đâu. Tôi là người đã lắp đặt nó khi tôi mua ngôi nhà đó. Nó nằm dưới một nắp cổng nhỏ ngụy trang gần lề đường cách cho Brian đang đứng khoảng 10 mét. Chỉ cần một thao tác vẫn đơn giản là có thể ngăn chặn thảm họa này. Nhưng tôi không di chuyển. Tôi không nói gì. Brian đang điên cuồng bấm điện thoại gọi cho mỗi thợ sửa ống nước trong danh bạ. Nhưng đây là ngày trước lễ tạ ơn. Mỗi thợ lành nghề đều đã nghị lễ hoặc đang bận rộn với những sự cố khẩn cấp khác. Tôi có thể thấy vẻ tuyệt vọng trên khuôn mặt anh ta khi hết cuộc gọi này đến cuộc gọi khác đi vào hộp thư thoại. Bố anh ta hét lên khi nhìn thấy tôi. "Bố ơi, giúp con với. Ống vỡ rồi. Bố biết cách sửa mà." Tôi nhìn con trai mình, người đàn ông đã chọn đứng về phía người phụ nữ đang sỉ nhục anh ta ngay trước mặt tôi. Tôi nhìn Dorothy, người đang chỉ trỏ và ra lệnh như một cải ngục. "Tôi xin lỗi Brian," tôi nói vọng sang giọng bình thản. "Tôi chỉ là khách mời danh dự tại bữa tiệc của riêng mình. Tôi không mang theo đồ nghề. Nhưng bố là nhà thầu mà anh ta vẫn nài. Đã nghỉ hưu," tôi nhắc lại. "Và ngoài ra tôi nghĩ Dorothy biết rõ hơn tôi. Bà ấy là người đã thuê thổ lập cái bồn tắm đó phải không? Chắc chắn bà ấy có sổ của họ. Dorothy quay lại trừng mắt nhìn tôi, sự căm ghét hiện rõ trên mặt, nhưng xen lẫn đó là sự sợ hãi thực sự. Nước vẫn tiếp tục phun lên biển sân sau của họ, thành một đầm lầy hôi thối. Tôi quay lưng lại và đi vào trong lều nơi không khí khô ráo ấm áp và thơm mùi hoa lan. Đôi khi cách tốt nhất để dạy một bài học là để tự nhiên làm công việc của nó. Và hôm nay bài học đó là về thủy lực học và nghiệp chướng. I was holding a glass of 1996 Cabernet Sauvignon up to the light, admiring the deep ruby color when the frantic pounding started on the temporary construction gate. It was a jarring sound that interrupted the jazz music playing softly in my marquee, but I did not spill a drop. I knew exactly who it was. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the complex tannins settle on my tongue before I nodded to the security guard to open the latch. Brian stumbled in. He looked nothing like the arrogant young man who had stood by while his wife insulted me weeks ago. He was soaked from the knees down his expensive designer sneakers, ruined by the toxic sludge filling his basement. He was shivering, his face pale and streaked with dirt. He ran toward me, stopping just short of the red carpet, breathing hard like a man who had just run a marathon. "Dad!" he gasped, his voice cracking. "You have to come. Please. It is rising so fast. The water is touching the electrical panel. I do not know what to do. The main valve is stuck." I looked at him. I looked at the mud on his hands. Then I looked down at my polished tuxedo shoes. I took a step back, ensuring a safe distance between his chaos and my elegance. "I am in the middle of a tasting. Brian," I said, my voice smooth and unhurried, "this is a very rare vintage. You really should try it sometime, if you ever learn to appreciate quality over trends." He looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "Dad, are you serious? The house is flooding. Dorothy is screaming that her boxes are getting wet. You are a master contractor. You built half the drainage systems in this town. You can fix this in 5 minutes." I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the legs run down the side. "I used to be a contractor," I corrected him gently. "But if you recall, the text message from your wife made it very clear. I am just a guest, and guests do not crawl into flooded basements to fix illegal plumbing connections installed by unlicensed amateurs." "But you are my father," he pleaded, tears actually welling in his eyes. "And you are a grown man who chose to let his mother-in-law run his household," I countered. I reached into the breast pocket of my dinner jacket. Brian's eyes lit up for a second, perhaps thinking I was reaching for a tool or a key. Instead, I pulled out a small, cream-colored business card. I extended it to him. He took it with trembling fingers. "Call this number," I said. "It is Highland Emergency Plumbing. They are the best in the city." Brian looked at the card, and his face fell even further. "Dad, I know these guys. They charge $400 just for the call-out fee. And it is a holiday. They will charge triple. We do not have that kind of money available on the credit cards right now." I shrugged, a gesture of indifference that seemed to cut him deeper than any insult. "Then I suggest you start bailing with a bucket, son. Or perhaps ask Dorothy to sell one of her handbags to cover the cost." Brian stood there frozen, realizing that the safety net he had relied on for 30 years was gone. I was not going to save him. I was not going to rush in with my toolbox and make the bad things go away. "I have retired from fixing your mistakes, Brian," I said, turning back to the sommelier, who was waiting with the next bottle. "Now, if you will excuse me, this Pinot Noir needs to breathe, and I believe you have some mopping up to do." He turned and ran back into the darkness, clutching the useless business card, while I turned my attention back to the wine. It had a finish of dark cherries, and if I was not mistaken, a distinct note of absolute victory. By 6 o'clock, the sun had set, and the line between success and failure became illuminated by 1,000 string lights. On my side of the property line, the evening had turned into a spectacle of wealth and influence. The street in front of my construction site was lined with a parade of engineering marvels. There were Bentleys gleaming under the street lamps, vintage Rolls-Royces with drivers waiting patiently inside, and the sleek silhouettes of high-end electric sedans. The valet service I had hired was working overtime parking cars for the mayor, the chief of police, and the city's top developers. The air was filled with the rich, smoky scent of roasting meat and the smooth, live notes of a saxophone player performing a perfect rendition of Fly Me to the Moon. Inside the white marquee tent, crystal glasses clinked in a rhythm of celebration. It was warm, it was bright, and it was undeniably the place to be. But just 50 feet away, the scene was straight out of a gothic horror novel. The illegal plumbing disaster from earlier in the day had done more than just flood the basement. As I had predicted, the rising water had eventually reached the main electrical panel. At 5:30 sharp, just as my first guests were arriving, the entire electrical grid of my son's house had short-circuited with a loud pop. Now the $2 million mansion stood as a dark, silent monolith against the night sky. There were no lights. There was no heating. And because everything in that smart home was electronic, there was not even a way to ring the doorbell. Through the large dining room window, illuminated only by the flickering, pathetic light of 3 scented candles, I could see them. It was a tableau of misery. Dorothy was sitting at the head of the table wrapped in a fur coat because the furnace was dead. Her face, cast in jagged shadows by the candlelight, looked twisted and terrifying. She was not eating off the fine china she bragged about. She was tearing into a cold, store-bought rotisserie chicken with her bare hands because the dishwasher was full of dirty plates they could not wash. Brittany sat next to her, scrolling endlessly on her phone, the blue light of the screen making her look like a ghost. She was likely trying to find a hotel that would take them, but I knew for a fact every suite in town was booked for the holiday. And then there was Brian. He sat at the far end of the table, staring into the darkness. He held a drumstick in one hand, but he was not eating. He was looking out the window. He was watching the silhouette of the waiters in my tent pouring vintage wine. He was listening to the laughter of the people who respected his father. The contrast was not just visible, it was visceral. On one side of the fence, life was a celebration of hard work and smart choices. On the other side, it was a cold, damp reality check served with a side of congealed gravy. I raised my glass toward their dark window, a silent toast to the consequences of their own actions. They wanted a private, immediate family Thanksgiving. Well, they got it. Just them, the cold, and the darkness they had created. The gravitational pull of wealth is a powerful force, stronger even than shame. I was standing near the entrance of the marquee, laughing at a joke made by the city councilman when I saw the shadows detach themselves from the darkness of the house next door. I knew it was only a matter of time. A narcissist like Dorothy acts like a moth to a flame. She physically cannot stop herself from flying toward the brightest light, even if she knows it will burn her alive. The sight of the mayor's Bentley and the sound of live jazz were simply too much for her to resist. She could not sit in the cold and eat store-bought chicken while the people she desperately wanted to be friends with were feasting on Wagyu beef 50 feet away. I watched them approach. It was a pathetic procession. Dorothy was leading the charge, dragging Brittany behind her like a prisoner of war. Because the power was out in their house, Dorothy had clearly applied her makeup by the flickering light of a scented candle. The result was grotesque. Her foundation was 2 shades too dark, applied so thickly it looked like spackle intended to cover the cracks in her life. Her lipstick was a violent shade of red that bled into the wrinkles around her mouth, and she had dusted herself with enough glitter to be visible from space. She was wearing a floor-length fur coat that I knew for a fact was rented, trying to project an image of old-money elegance while walking across a muddy construction site. Brittany looked less like a socialite and more like a hostage. Her head was down, her shoulders hunched. She knew this was wrong. She knew they had been explicitly excluded. But she was too weak to stand up to her mother's bulldozing ambition. I could see Dorothy whispering to her, likely coaching her on what to say, instructing her to smile, to play the role of the loving daughter, who just wanted to wish her father-in-law a happy holiday. But I knew the truth. Dorothy didn't care about me. She didn't care about the holiday. She had seen the guest list. She saw an opportunity to corner the mayor near the buffet and beg for a favor, or to trap the real estate developers and pitch them some half-baked interior design idea. They reached the edge of the red carpet I had laid down over the plywood walkway. Dorothy paused to adjust her hair, putting on a blinding, terrifyingly fake smile. She linked arms with Brittany, transforming instantly from a shrieking banshee into a caricature of a refined lady. It was a performance that deserved an award for sheer audacity. She was about to try and crash the most exclusive party in town, using the very daughter-in-law who had texted me to stay away as her ticket in. I took a sip of my wine and signaled to the head of my security team, a massive man named Tiny. The show was about to get interesting, but not in the way Dorothy expected. She thought she was walking into a networking opportunity. She was actually walking into a wall. Dorothy stepped onto the plush red carpet, with the air of a queen returning to her throne, oblivious to the mud caking the heels of her rented shoes. She tightened her grip on Brittany's arm, practically dragging her daughter toward the entrance of the marquee. I could see the hunger in her eyes as she looked past the velvet ropes, spotting the mayor laughing near the buffet and the flash of diamond jewelry among the crowd. She adjusted her fur coat, put on her most dazzling fraudulent smile, and prepared to breeze past security as if the laws of physics and social etiquette did not apply to her. But she had not accounted for Tiny. My head of security was 6 feet 5 inches of solid muscle, a former linebacker who had stopped running backs far more determined than a desperate interior designer. He did not speak. He simply took one large step to the left, placing his massive frame directly in her path. He crossed his arms effectively, becoming a human wall between Dorothy and the paradise she sought. "Excuse me," Dorothy said, her voice dripping with condensation and entitlement. "You are in my way. We are here to see Mr. Prentice. We are family." Tiny did not budge. He stared at a point somewhere above her head, his face a mask of professional indifference. "I am afraid this is a private event, ma'am," he rumbled, his voice deep enough to vibrate the floorboards. "Invitation only." Dorothy laughed, a shrill, nervous sound that grated on the ears. "Oh, do not be ridiculous. I am the mother of his daughter-in-law. We do not need invitations. Wallace knows we are coming. Now step aside before I have you fired." That was my cue. I had been watching from the shadows of the tent entrance, swirling the vintage Cabernet in my glass. I stepped out into the cool night air, the light from the chandeliers casting a halo behind me. I was warm, I was well-fed, and I was holding all the cards. "Is there a problem here, Tiny?" I asked, my voice calm, but carrying enough weight to slice through the tension. Wallace, Dorothy cried out, her face lighting up with relief that was entirely misplaced. "Thank goodness. Tell this brute to let us in. We just wanted to pop over and wish you a happy Thanksgiving. And I saw the governor is inside. I have been dying to tell him about my ideas for the new city park." She took a step forward, expecting the rope to drop. She expected me to crumble, to save face, to be the polite pushover I had been for years. I did not signal Tiny to move. Instead, I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch out until it became uncomfortable. I looked at Brittany, who was staring at her feet, mortified. Then I looked at Dorothy, whose smile was starting to falter. "I am confused, Dorothy," I said softly. "I received a text message quite clearly stating that you wanted a holiday for immediate family only. I respected that wish. I stayed away." "Oh, that was just a misunderstanding." She waved her hand dismissively. "We are here now. Let's not make a scene in front of your friends." I reached out and took the clipboard from Tiny's hand. I made a show of it. I put on my reading glasses. I ran my finger down the list of names, past the senators, past the CEOs, past the doctors. I took my time, letting her watch me check every single line. "I am looking, Dorothy," I said, tapping the paper. "I see a lot of names here. people who respect me, people who did not cancel on me via text message. But I am looking for the name Miller, and I just cannot seem to find it. I snapped the clipboard shut and handed it back to Tiny. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. "I am sorry," I said, looking her dead in the eye, my voice devoid of any warmth. "But this party requires a physical invitation, and you simply put are not on the list." "But, Brittany," she stammered, pointing at her daughter. "Brittany is welcome to come in if she leaves you outside," I said coldly. "But we both know she is not strong enough to do that yet, is she?" I turned my back on them. "Tiny, please keep the entrance clear. We have important guests arriving." As I walked back into the warmth of the party, I heard Dorothy gasp, the sound of a woman who had finally hit a wall she could not manipulate, charm, or bully her way through. I had barely taken 3 steps back toward the warmth of the marquee when the explosion happened. It was not a physical bomb, but the social impact was just as destructive. The rejection at the gate had snapped the final tether of Dorothy's sanity. She realized that charm would not work, that influence would not work, and that her name held no weight in my world. So she resorted to the only weapon she had left. She chose the nuclear option. She chose to make a scene so loud, so embarrassing, and so public that she thought I would be forced to let her in just to shut her up. She was wrong. "You heartless monster," she screamed. The sound tore through the crisp night air, sharper than the feedback from a microphone. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated victimhood. The smooth jazz saxophone stopped abruptly. The low hum of polite conversation inside the tent died instantly. Every head turned. The governor, who had been in the middle of telling a joke, froze with his mouth half open. The chief of surgery lowered his wine glass. 50 of the most powerful people in the state turned their eyes toward the entrance where Dorothy was currently throwing a temper tantrum worthy of a toddler, but with the volume of a banshee. "Look at him," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at my back. "Look at the great Wallace Prentice. He stands there drinking champagne while his own son freezes in the dark next door. We have no heat. We have no food. He is letting his own family starve in the cold while he feeds strangers." She paused for breath and her chest heaving under the rented fur coat. She looked around the crowd, making eye contact with the shocked guests, mistaking their silence for sympathy. She thought she had them. She thought she was painting a picture of a cruel miser, hoarding his wealth. "He has millions," she wailed, stepping closer to the velvet rope, her mascara running down her cheeks. "And he refuses to help us. He watches us suffer." What kind of father does that? What kind of human being leaves his children to rot in a flooded house on Thanksgiving? I turned around slowly. I did not look angry. I looked bored. I watched as Brittany tugged frantically at her mother's arm, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "Mom, stop, please stop, everyone is staring." But Dorothy pulled away, fueled by the adrenaline of her own performance. The reaction from my guests was not what she expected. These were people who valued dignity above all else. They valued composure. To them, a public display of emotion was bad, but a public display of financial desperation was unforgivable. They did not look at me with judgment. They looked at Dorothy with the kind of detached, clinical curiosity one reserves for a rabid animal frothing at the mouth. They looked at her cheap, glittery makeup. They looked at her manic gestures. And they looked at the sheer classlessness of begging for food at a black-tie gala. The mayor leaned over to the developer next to him and whispered something. They both chuckled softly. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was the laugh of exclusion. Dorothy had wanted to be part of their world. In that moment, by screaming about her poverty and her entitlement, she had ensured that she would never, ever be invited to even a charity luncheon in this town again. She had committed social suicide in real time, and I had the best seat in the house. I swirled my wine, watching her pant for breath, waiting for her to realize that the silence facing her wasn't an invitation to continue. It was a verdict. Dorothy finished her tirade, her chest heaving under the rented fur, her eyes wild with the intoxication of her own performance. She looked around at the silent crowd, mistaking their shock for solidarity. She thought she had painted me as Scrooge, a miser hoarding gold, while Tiny Tim froze in the snow. She thought she had won. But she had forgotten the first rule of warfare, which is to never attack an enemy who keeps better records than you do. I did not shout back. I did not defend myself with words. I simply turned my head slightly to the right, toward the elevated DJ booth at the back of the marquee. My DJ, a sharp kid who knew exactly when to drop the beat and when to follow orders, caught my eye. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. He cut the music. The jazz saxophone trailed off into an abrupt, heavy silence. The sudden lack of sound was disorienting, drawing every eye in the room away from Dorothy and toward the stage. Behind the band was a massive 100-inch high-definition LED screen. Until this moment, it had been displaying ambient loops of falling snow and crackling fireplaces to set the mood. Now the screen went pitch black. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Dorothy looked confused, her mouth slightly open, unsure why the spotlight had shifted. Then the screen flickered to life. It was not a holiday greeting. It was a spreadsheet. Specifically, it was a synchronized slideshow of high-resolution bank statements and wire transfer receipts. The first image appeared crisp and undeniable, towering over the guests. It was a check dated 5 years ago. The memo line read, "Down payment assistance." The amount was $50,000. A gasp went through the room. I took a sip of my wine as the screen began to cycle. It moved chronologically, a relentless timeline of my generosity and their dependency. Click. A wire transfer for $12,000. Memo Brian's credit card debt consolidation. Click. Another transfer. $8,000. Memo Brittany's student loan rescue. Click. A copy of a cashier's check made out to a luxury car dealership. The memo simply said, "Lease buyout," because Dorothy had crashed her credit score too low to qualify on her own. The images sped up. It became a blur of financial support. Medical bills I had covered. Vacations I had subsidized. Emergency funds for unexpected repairs that I knew were just cover for shopping sprees. The guests were no longer looking at me with curiosity. They were looking at the screen, doing the mental math. I saw the mayor shake his head. I saw the bank president, who was a guest, recognize the routing numbers. Dorothy turned around slowly, her eyes tracking the giant glowing evidence of her own hypocrisy. She watched as a receipt for a $10,000 home staging consultation fee she had demanded last year flashed on the screen. She shrank inside her coat. The narrative of the starving, abandoned family was disintegrating, pixel by pixel. Then the slideshow stopped. The screen went black for a dramatic second before the final figure appeared in bold white text against the dark background. It was the cumulative total of every cent I had given them over the last 60 months. $450,000. The number hung there glowing in the night air. Nearly $500,000. That was not the donation of a heartless father. That was the GDP of a small island nation poured into a black hole of ingratitude. I stepped forward, the gravel crunching under my shoes, sounding like thunder in the silence. I pointed my glass at the screen, then at Dorothy. "You claimed I left you to starve," I said, my voice projecting clearly without a microphone. "But the math suggests I have been feeding you for 5 years. You did not starve, Dorothy. You just forgot to say thank you when your plate was full." The shame that washed over her was palpable. She wasn't just exposed as a liar. She was exposed as a leech. The guests turned their backs on her, not out of malice, but out of disgust. The verdict was in, and it was written in 6 figures on a 100-inch screen. The silence in the tent was heavy enough to crush a lesser woman, but Dorothy was still standing there, trembling, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit strategy. She opened her mouth, likely to spin another lie, likely to claim the numbers were fabricated. But I was not finished. I had one final nail to drive into the coffin of her reputation. I raised my hand again, and the massive screen behind me shifted one last time. The spreadsheet vanished. In its place appeared a single high-definition image of a credit card statement transaction from just 3 days ago. It was the transaction Brian had tried to hide. $30,000 at the Hermes boutique downtown. I stepped off the red carpet and walked onto the muddy grass, closing the distance between us until I was standing right in front of her. I looked down at her arm. Clutched tightly in her hand, resting against the cheap rental fur, was the bag. The black leather Birkin. The symbol of status she valued more than her own family's financial security. I pointed at the screen, then I pointed at the bag. "That is a beautiful purse, Dorothy," I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent tent. $30,000. My son told me he bought it as an investment. But we both know the truth. He bought it to buy your silence. He bought it because you made his life a living hell until he gave you what you wanted. She pulled the bag closer to her body, covering it like a shield. "You came here tonight screaming that I left you to starve." I continued, my anger finally bleeding into my voice. "You stood in front of the most respected people in this city and called me a monster. But look at your arm, Dorothy. You are holding the reason your basement is flooded. You are holding the reason you have no heat. You spent the money for the plumber on leather and gold hardware." The crowd murmured. The disgust was palpable. The mayor turned away, unable to even look at her. "You used my money to buy your vanity," I said, delivering the final blow. "You used my credit line to purchase a costume of wealth so you could pretend you belong in this tent. And now, standing here in rented shoes and a stolen lifestyle, you have the audacity to demand my respect." I leaned in close, so close I could smell the stale perfume and the fear coming off her. "Respect is earned, Dorothy. It cannot be put on a credit card." That was it. The facade shattered completely. A sob broke from her throat, a raw, ugly sound of total defeat. She looked at the bag, then at the judging faces of the elite she so desperately wanted to impress. She realized she would never be one of them. She would always be the woman who bought a purse instead of paying her bills. She turned and ran. She did not walk with dignity. She scrambled away into the darkness, slipping in the mud, clutching her $30,000 bag like a life preserver. Brittany cast one last heartbroken look at me, then turned and chased after her mother, disappearing into the gloom of their cold, dark house. I turned back to my guests. I adjusted my cufflinks and signaled the DJ. "My apologies for the entertainment," I said, raising my glass. "Please let us not let the neighbors ruin the vintage." The music started again. The conversation resumed. But the air was lighter now. The parasite had been exposed, and the host was finally free. The morning sun offered no warmth to the inhabitants of the house next door. While my crew was efficiently dismantling the party tent, stacking chairs, and loading the crystal into padded crates with military precision, the atmosphere inside my son's home was colder than the frost on the lawn. The power was still out, the basement was still a toxic swimming pool, and the shame of the previous night hung in the stagnant air like a thick fog. I watched from the window of my site trailer, sipping hot coffee as the drama unfolded in their glass-walled living room. They had no idea that their frantic gestures were as easy to read as a silent movie. Dorothy had not slept. I could tell by the way she paced the living room, wrapped in 3 heavy duvets, looking like a vengeful caterpillar. She was not mourning the loss of her dignity or reflecting on her behavior. Narcissists do not self-reflect. They reload. She was cornering Brian, who was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, shivering in a hoodie. I could almost hear the venom dripping from her words, even through the double-paned glass. She was waving her arms, pointing at my property, then pointing at her chest, playing the victim with Oscar-worthy dedication. Inside that freezing room, the narrative was being rewritten. Dorothy was telling Brian that I was the villain. She was telling him that the display on the screen was not a factual accounting of debts, but a malicious, calculated attack designed to ruin them. She was using words like slander and defamation. She was likely screaming that I had doctored the numbers or that private gifts were never meant to be public knowledge. She was gaslighting him into believing that my generosity was actually a weapon I had used to bludgeon them. Brian looked up, his face gray with exhaustion. I saw him mouth a question, likely asking if they really had a case. Dorothy slammed her hand on the table. She pointed at Brittany, who was curled up on the sofa sobbing. She was weaponizing her daughter's tears. She was telling Brian that as a husband, it was his duty to defend the honor of the women in his house. She was telling him that they could sue me for millions. She convinced him that a lawsuit would solve everything, that a judge would look at the mean old man next door and award them enough money to fix the plumbing, pay off the debts, and restore their standing in society. I saw Brian stand up. He looked out the window, his eyes meeting mine across the fence. For a second, I saw the son I raised, the boy who knew right from wrong. He knew the bank statements were real. He knew the handbag was real. He knew I had supported them when no one else would. But then he looked back at Brittany, shivering and crying, and at Dorothy, who was looking at him with a predatory expectation. He was weak. He was tired. And he just wanted the screaming to stop. I saw him nod. It was a slow, reluctant nod, but it was enough. He was agreeing to call a lawyer. He was agreeing to bite the hand that fed him because he was too cowardly to muzzle the dog that was barking in his ear. He thought he was protecting his family. He did not realize he was about to sign his own death warrant. They wanted a legal battle. I would give them a war. Richard walked into my trailer just as the rain began to fall, turning the construction site into a sea of gray mud. But unlike the weather, my attorney looked positively radiant. He was not carrying a summons or a cease and desist letter from Brian's newfound legal counsel. He was carrying a long cardboard tube, the kind used for architectural blueprints. He tapped the tube against the side of his leg, humming a little tune, which was terrifying behavior for a man who charged $600 an hour to be professionally pessimistic. He cleared the coffee cups off my desk and uncapped the tube. He slid out a document that smelled of dust and old libraries. It was not a digital printout. It was a yellowed, fragile map of the original subdivision plat, dated October 1950. The ink was faded, but the lines were drawn with the precise, unwavering hand of a draftsman who took pride in his work. Richard pinned the corners down with heavy staplers. "Look closely, Wallace," he said, tracing a line with his gold pen. "This is the original lot division. Before the McMansions, before the subdivision, this was all farmland." I looked at the map. I saw the square that represented the foreclosure property I now owned, and I saw the larger rectangle next to it, which was now my son's estate. "Focus on the access point," Richard whispered, tapping the paper. "When the developer split these lots 70 years ago, they made a mistake. The topography is steep. To get to the building site where Brian's house now stands, they had to build the driveway across the corner of the lower lot. Your lot." I squinted at the map. The current paved driveway, the one Brian used every day to park his sedan, cut a clean 40-degree angle across my property before entering his land. "It is called an easement," Richard explained, anticipating my question. "It is a legal right to use someone else's land for a specific purpose, like ingress and egress. Usually these are permanent. They run with the land forever." He paused for dramatic effect, leaning in closer. "But whoever wrote this deed in 1950 was paranoid. They added a sunset clause. The easement for the driveway and the main municipal sewer connection was granted for exactly 60 years. I did the mental math instantly. 1950 plus 60 years, 2010. It expired, I said, looking up at him. Richard grinned like a shark who just smelled blood in the water. It expired over a decade ago. Nobody noticed. Not the bank, not the title company, and certainly not Dorothy. They have been driving across your land and flushing their toilets through your dirt illegally for 10 years. Technically, Wallace, that driveway is yours, and that sewer pipe, that is yours too. I looked out the window at the winding asphalt driveway that led to Brian's garage. I looked at the spot where the underground pipes connected to the city main. They were threatening to sue me for hurting their feelings. They were threatening to drag me into court for defamation. They had no idea that I held the legal equivalent of a nuclear launch code. So let me get this straight, I said, leaning back in my chair. If I were to say reclaim my property, you would be well within your rights to build a fence. Richard finished the sentence for me. You can block the driveway. You can cap the sewer line. You can effectively turn their $2 million mansion into a landlocked island with no road access and no plumbing. It is not harassment, Wallace. It is simply enforcing your property rights. I looked back at the map. It was beautiful. It was the most beautiful piece of paper I had ever seen. Brian wanted a legal battle. He was bringing a knife to a gunfight. I had the map. I had the land. And as of this moment, I had the power to turn off their world. Leave the map, Richard, I said, reaching for my phone to call my fencing contractor. I think it is time we secured our borders. Speed is a weapon in war, and I have always been a blitzkrieg tactician. I did not wait for a court order or a polite conversation. 10 minutes after Richard left my trailer, I had a specialized fencing crew on site. These were not the guys who install white picket fences for suburban gardens. These were the guys who secure prison perimeters and industrial compounds. They brought diamond-tipped core drills and heavy-duty steel bollards. They brought quick-setting industrial concrete that cures in 15 minutes and becomes harder than bedrock. I stood on the porch of the foreclosure and directed the operation with the precision of a conductor. The survey line Richard had identified ran diagonally across the asphalt of the driveway my son used every day. It was the only entrance and exit to his property. To the naked eye, it looked like one continuous piece of pavement, but legally it was a bridge across my territory. And I was burning the bridge. The sound of the core drills biting into the driveway was aggressive and loud. The crew drilled a line of 6 holes directly across the width of the asphalt. Into each hole went a 6-inch solid steel post followed by the concrete. Within an hour, they had welded a heavy-gauge chain-link fence to the posts. It was ugly. It was industrial. And it was absolutely impenetrable. I had effectively sliced the artery that connected their house to the outside world. I was leaning against one of the new posts, testing the stability, when the garage door of the mansion rolled up. It was Brittany. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying her car keys, likely heading to a meeting with the lawyer they had threatened me with. She climbed into her white SUV and put it in reverse. She was checking her makeup in the rearview mirror, so she did not see the new addition to the landscape until her backup camera started screaming. She slammed on the brakes, inches from the steel mesh. I watched through the fence as her head whipped around. She stared at the barrier in total confusion. She put the car in drive, then back in reverse as if the fence were a glitch in the matrix that would disappear if she rebooted the engine. It did not disappear. She honked the horn. I did not move. She rolled down the window and screamed at me. "You cannot put a fence here. This is our driveway. Move it right now or I am calling the police." "It is not your driveway, Brittany," I said calmly, leaning closer to the mesh. "It is my land. The easement expired in 2010. You have been trespassing every time you went to buy a latte for the last decade. Today, the toll booth is closed." She looked at the fence, then at the street, which was only 10 feet away, but might as well have been on the moon. Her car was trapped. There was no way to get it out. The geometry of the lot meant she could not drive around on the grass without sliding into a ravine. Her luxury SUV was now nothing more than a very expensive paperweight, stored in a garage she could not leave. "If you want to leave the property, I suggest you walk," I said, pointing to the muddy slope of the lawn. "It is good cardio." She sat there gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, realizing that her freedom had just been revoked. She was no longer a suburban queen. She was a prisoner on an island of her own making, and the only way off was to trudge through the mud like a peasant. I tapped the steel post one last time, satisfied with the solidity of my work, and walked away, leaving her to figure out how to navigate a world where the road literally ended at my feet. The fence was merely a surface-level inconvenience. It stopped their cars, it stopped their deliveries, and it stopped their pride. But what I was about to do next would stop their ability to live like civilized human beings. After securing the driveway, I walked back to the open trench, where we had exposed the utility lines. According to the expired easement on Richard's map, the main sewer discharge pipe from my son's house did not just cross my land. It joined the municipal line right in the middle of what was now my construction zone. Legally, that pipe was an unauthorized encroachment on my property. And as a responsible landowner, I had a duty to perform maintenance on my infrastructure. Hank was standing in the mud, looking down at the heavy iron valve that controlled the flow from the mansion next door. He looked hesitant. He had capped illegal lines before, but never one that served a house currently occupied by 3 people. "Boss, are you sure about this?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Once we close this valve, they have maybe 3 flushes before the system backs up. It is going to get messy very fast." I looked at the valve. It was old, rusted, and completely within my rights to operate. "I am not cutting their water, Hank," I said, channeling my best innocent tone. "I am simply conducting a pressure test on the lines located on my property. Safety first. We cannot have unauthorized sewage flowing through a construction site. Close it." Hank sighed, fit a heavy wrench onto the nut, and turned it. The metal groaned a screeching sound of protest against decades of rust before slamming shut with a final dull thud. The flow was severed. The connection was broken. I checked my watch. It was 9 in the morning. They were all awake. They were all using the facilities. For the first hour, nothing happened. That is the insidious nature of plumbing. The pipes hold a certain amount of volume, creating a false sense of security. I watched from my trailer, waiting for the physics of the situation to catch up with the reality of my revenge. The first sign of trouble was a confused face at the window. It was Brian. He was likely standing in the downstairs powder room, jiggling the handle, wondering why the water level was rising instead of falling. He probably plunged it thinking it was a simple clog. But you cannot plunge a closed valve. 10 minutes later, the scream tore through the morning air. It was Dorothy. She must have been upstairs in the master bath. Unlike the gentle rise in the downstairs toilet, the physics of backflow pressure meant that the waste from the upper levels had nowhere to go but to seek the path of least resistance. I imagined the scene. The dark, foul water gurgling up from the pristine porcelain, spilling over the rim, soaking into the expensive bath mats spreading across the tile floor. It would not just be water. It would be the physical manifestation of everything they had tried to flush away, coming back to haunt them. I saw the back door fly open. Brian ran out, gagging, holding a towel over his mouth. He looked at the trench, then at me. "Dad," he choked out. "The toilets. They are exploding. There is sewage everywhere. It is coming out of the shower drains." I leaned against the excavator, looking at him with mild concern. "That sounds like a terrible sanitation issue, Brian," I said. "I am currently performing maintenance on the lines on my property. I estimate the work will take about 2 weeks. I suggest you call a septic company." "Oh wait, you cannot. The driveway is blocked." I watched the realization hit him. He was trapped in a house that was rapidly filling with his own waste, with no way out, and no way to get help in. The smell was already starting to drift across the yard, but to me it smelled like justice. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the brand new galvanized steel of my fence, creating a disco ball effect that was far too festive for the misery unfolding next door. Dorothy had called the police. Again. It was her default setting whenever the world refused to bend to her will. She treated the local law enforcement not as officers of the peace but as her personal concierge service summoned to arrest anyone who inconvenienced her. I watched from the other side of the chain-link barrier as 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb. They could not drive up the driveway because, well, I had turned it into a fortress. 2 officers stepped out, looking weary. They knew this address. They knew Dorothy. One of them, a sergeant named Miller, who had responded to her noise complaints against my jackhammers weeks ago, adjusted his belt and walked up to the fence. Dorothy was already there, clutching the wire mesh like a prisoner in a B-movie, screaming about false imprisonment and endangerment. "Officer, arrest him immediately," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He has blocked our exit. He has cut off our plumbing. We are trapped in there with raw sewage. This is criminal. This is attempted murder." I walked over calmly holding a plastic folder. I did not raise my voice. I did not look like a maniac. I looked like a man who had his paperwork in order. "Good afternoon, Sergeant," I said, offering a polite nod. "I apologize for the disturbance. My neighbor seems to be having a difficult time understanding property law." Dorothy was practically foaming at the mouth. "He blocked the driveway. You have to make him take it down." The sergeant looked at the heavy steel posts, then at the trapped cars, then at me. "Mr. Prentice, you cannot just block access to a residence. That is a safety hazard." "Actually, Sergeant, I think you will find that I can," I said, sliding the survey map and the deed out of the folder. I handed them through the gap in the fence. I pointed to the highlighted section. "This is the original plat from 1950. As you can see, the easement allowing them to cross my land for driveway access and utility connection expired 11 years ago. It was a temporary grant. It is gone." The sergeant took the map. He turned on his flashlight even though it was day to read the fine print. He traced the lines with his finger. He looked at the date. He looked at the signature. His partner looked over his shoulder. They muttered to each other for a moment, flipping the page to check the county seal. Dorothy went quiet, watching them, waiting for the handcuffs to come out. Finally, the sergeant looked up. He handed the papers back to me through the fence. He took a deep breath and turned to Dorothy. "Ma'am, the paperwork appears to be in order. According to this, the strip of land your driveway is built on belongs to Mr. Prentice. He has the right to secure his property." "But we can't get out," Dorothy screamed. "You can walk out, ma'am," the officer said, gesturing to the grass. "You are not physically restrained. Your cars are stuck, yes, but that is a dispute between you and the landowner." "What about the sewage?" she wailed. He cut the pipes. The officer grimaced. The smell was drifting out to the street now. "If the pipes are on his land and the easement is expired, he is not obligated to maintain them for you." "Listen, ma'am, I am sorry, but this is a civil matter. We cannot enforce a private easement dispute. You need a lawyer, not a police officer. We cannot force him to take down a fence on his own land." Civil matter. The 2 words that act like kryptonite to a narcissist. It meant the police were powerless to help her. It meant she could not scream her way out of this. "But he is ruining us," she sobbed, sliding down the fence until she was kneeling in the dirt. The sergeant tipped his cap to me. "Have a good day, Mr. Prentice. Try to keep the noise down." They got back in their cars and drove away, leaving Dorothy clinging to the cold steel of my fence, staring at the taillights that represented her last hope fading into the distance. She was alone with the mud, the fence, and the consequences. The smell of surrender is distinct, but in this case it was heavily mixed with the odor of backed-up plumbing. I saw Brian trudging across the wet grass that separated our properties. He was not wearing his usual designer suit. He was wearing sweatpants and old boots slipping slightly in the mud as he navigated the slope around the massive steel fence I had erected. He looked like a refugee from a disaster zone, which in a way he was. I was waiting for him at the edge of my site trailer, sitting comfortably in a camp chair with a clipboard on my lap. I did not get up to greet him. The dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the father waiting for a visit. I was the landlord waiting for a tenant. Dad, Brian said, his voice hoarse. He stopped 10 feet away, conscious of the stench clinging to his clothes. We cannot take it anymore. Dorothy is vomiting. Brittany is staying at a friend's house, but she won't come back until the water works. You have to open the valve. Please, we will do anything. I looked at him, studying the dark circles under his eyes. He was finally ready to negotiate. I did not offer sympathy. I offered paperwork. I am a businessman, Brian, I said, picking up a crisp, stapled document from my lap. And I have found a solution to your problem. Since the easement has expired, you are essentially asking to rent the use of my land for your car and your waste. I am willing to grant that right. Brian's face lit up with pathetic hope. Really? You will open the gate? For a fee, I corrected him, extending the contract. This is a standard land use agreement. It grants you a revocable license to cross my property and utilize my sewage infrastructure. Brian grabbed the paper and scanned it quickly. His eyes widened as he reached the bottom of the first page. $5,000, he choked out. $5,000 a month. Dad, this is insane. That is more than our mortgage. We cannot afford this. I shrugged, taking a sip of my water. Supply and demand, son. You have a very high demand for a flushing toilet, and I possess the only supply of a functional drain pipe. The price includes a road maintenance fee, an environmental impact fee for your waste, and a premium for the annoyance of having you as neighbors. Take it or leave it. Brian stared at the number, his hands shaking. We don't have the money. You know we don't. Dorothy's credit cards are maxed out. I am living paycheck to paycheck. I nodded. I expected that, which is why I included option B. I flipped the page to the back of the agreement. Option B is a sale. I explained calmly. I am willing to purchase the property from you. I will pay off the remaining balance of your mortgage, which will free you from the bank, and I will give you $10,000 in cash to help you move into a nice small apartment, somewhere far away. Brian looked at me with horror. You want to buy the house for the mortgage value, Dad? That house is worth $2 million. You are trying to steal it from us. It is worth $2 million if it has a driveway and working plumbing, I said, cold as ice. Right now, without access or sanitation, it is a condemned building on a landlocked island. It is worth zero, Brian. In fact, it is a liability. I am offering you a lifeboat. You can either pay the rent and stay on a sinking ship, or you can sell me the wreck and swim to shore. He looked back at the dark-smelling mansion where his mother-in-law was waiting. He looked at the contract. He realized that the equity he thought he had was an illusion. He didn't own a castle. He owned a trap. I will. I have to talk to Brittany, he whispered, defeated. You do that, I said, checking my watch. But Brian, the offer expires at midnight, and I hear it is supposed to rain again tomorrow. I would not want to be in that basement when the water rises. He turned and walked back toward the mud, clutching the paper that marked the end of his arrogant lifestyle, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The flickering light of the candles in my son's living room cast long, dancing shadows against the glass, turning the argument inside into a silent film of absolute dysfunction. I did not need to be in the room to know what was happening. Brian had returned with my ultimatum, and the reality of their situation had finally detonated the landmine they had been sitting on for years. The contract I offered was not just a legal document. It was a mirror, and looking into it was destroying them. I could see Dorothy pacing back and forth, her arms waving wildly. She had snatched the paper from Brian's hand and read it. Now she was turning her rage not on me, but on the easiest target she could find, her own daughter. I could see her pointing a finger in Brittany's face, her mouth moving in a scream that vibrated the window pane. She was telling Brittany that this was her fault. She was screaming that Brittany was useless, that she had failed to control her husband, and that she had failed to charm me. She called her own child a failure for not securing the inheritance. That was the spark that finally ignited the gas leak. Brian stood up. For the first time in his life, he did not look down. He did not apologize. He grabbed a vase from the table, one of Dorothy's pretentious decorative pieces, and smashed it against the wall. The vibration traveled through the ground to where I stood. The room went still. I saw Brian point at the back door. He was yelling now. I could hear his voice muffled by the glass, deep and guttural. He was telling Dorothy to get out. She laughed at him. She crossed her arms, confident in her control. But Brian did not back down. He advanced on her, backing her toward the sliding glass door. He was listing her crimes. The debt, the car, the hot tub, the fence, the ruin of his relationship with me. He told her that she was a cancer that had eaten his life from the inside out. He opened the sliding door. The cold night air rushed in. "Get out," he screamed, his voice carrying clearly over the fence. "Get out of my house. Go sleep in your rental car. Go sleep in the mud. I do not care. But you are not staying here another minute." Dorothy looked at him, then at Brittany, expecting her daughter to jump to her defense. But Brittany was curled on the sofa, sobbing into her hands. Dorothy realized her reign was over. She grabbed her purse, the one I had exposed on the screen, and stormed out into the darkness, cursing them both to hell as she stumbled toward the property line. Brian slammed the door and locked it. He turned to his wife, perhaps expecting a moment of solidarity. He reached out a hand to her, but the damage was too deep. Brittany stood up, swatting his hand away. She was not grateful. She was hysterical. She screamed that he was a loser, that he had let his father humiliate them, that he was not a real man because he could not provide a working toilet or a way to drive to the store. "I want a divorce," she screamed, the words cutting through the silence of the night. "I am going with my mother. I am not staying in this hellhole with you." She grabbed her coat and ran out the same door, chasing after the woman who had abused her just moments ago. Brian stood alone in the center of the dark, freezing room. He had finally stood up for himself, but it was 5 years too late. The house was empty. The silence was absolute. And for the first time, he was truly the king of his castle, ruling over a kingdom of wreckage. The ink on the sales contract was barely dry when the final act of this tragedy began. Richard had handled the closing in the site trailer that very morning. There were no negotiations this time, no arrogant demands, and certainly no threats of lawsuits. Brian and Brittany sat there in silence, their eyes red from crying and exhaustion, and signed away their claim to the kingdom they could not afford to keep. They took the buyout. They took the check that would pay off the bank and leave them with just enough for a security deposit on a rental apartment in a much less prestigious zip code. I now owned the house. I owned the land. And I owned the satisfaction of watching them leave. Because I had not removed the fence, the moving truck could not enter the driveway. It sat idling on the main street, its hazard lights blinking a massive white whale that could not reach the shore. This meant that every single item they wanted to keep had to be carried by hand across 200 feet of rain-soaked, churned-up clay. It was a reverse red carpet, a muddy walk of shame that stripped away the last layers of their pretense. I stood on my porch and watched. It was a pitiful sight. Brittany, the woman who once looked down on me for wearing work boots, was struggling to navigate the slippery slope in her designer sneakers. She was carrying armfuls of clothes on hangers, her expensive dresses wrapped in clear plastic. But the wind was cruel. A gust blew a plastic bag open, and the hem of a silk evening gown dragged through the brown sludge. She did not scream. She did not curse. She just yanked it up, leaving a streak of mud on the fabric, her face a mask of numb resignation. The fight had completely gone out of her. She was no longer a socialite. She was just a tired woman moving out of a house she never truly earned. Brian looked even worse. He was hauling boxes of kitchenware, his back bent under the weight of the life he had failed to maintain. He slipped twice, dropping a box of what sounded like expensive spices into a puddle. He did not even bother to pick up the jars. He just kept walking, trudging back and forth between the dark, cold house and the waiting truck. There were no hired movers. They could not afford them. It was just the two of them, sweating and shivering in the damp air, dismantling their facade one box at a time. It took them 6 hours to clear out the essentials. They left the heavy furniture. They left the grand piano nobody knew how to play. They left the rotisserie chicken boxes on the counter. When the last box was loaded, Brian walked over to the fence where I was standing. He did not look me in the eye. He reached through the chain-link mesh and dropped a set of keys into my hand. The metal felt cold and heavy. "Good luck, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. I did not wish him luck. Luck is for people who play the lottery. Consequences are for people who play games with their family. "Drive safe, Brian," I said simply. He turned and walked away, climbing into the passenger seat of the moving truck because his luxury sedan was still trapped in the garage, another asset I had acquired by default. As the truck rumbled away, spewing exhaust into the gray sky, I looked at the empty mansion next door. It stood dark and silent, a monument to greed that had finally been toppled. The neighborhood was quiet again. The parasites were gone. And for the first time in months, the air smelled clean. Spring has finally returned to Barrington, and for the first time in years, the flowers blooming along the property line do not feel like a boundary, but rather a bridge. It has been exactly 12 months since the moving truck rumbled away into the gray mist, taking the noise and the drama with it. The neighborhood has healed. The scars on the land, where the heavy machinery once tore up the earth, have been covered by thick green grass. The steel fence, once a symbol of my necessary cruelty, was taken down 6 months ago. I did not replace it. I no longer need to protect myself from my neighbors because now the entire neighborhood is my family. I decided not to sell the mansion. Flipping it for a profit felt too easy, too impersonal. Instead, I did something that would have made Dorothy faint from shock. I knocked down the interior walls. I connected my humble foreclosure project with the grand hollow shell next door. I turned the two properties into a single, sprawling community center. The garage where Brittany's luxury SUV was once held hostage is now a woodworking shop open to the public. The basement that was once filled with sewage and ruined designer boxes has been sanitized, waterproofed, and converted into a game room for the local teenagers. And the backyard, the site of the infamous survey war, is now a playground. I sit on my new wraparound porch, a cup of Earl Grey tea steaming in my hands, watching the transformation. Where the wall of arrogant arborvitae trees once stood, there are now picnic tables. Where the illegal hot tub spewed its filth, there is a sandbox filled with laughing children. The silence of the wealthy elite has been replaced by the chaotic, joyful noise of life. The mayor even stopped by last week, not for a black tie gala, but to drop off his grandkids for an art class we host in the sunroom. But the most satisfying renovation has taken place miles away from here. I received a letter yesterday. It was handwritten on plain notebook paper, not the heavy gold-embossed cardstock Brian used to favor. There was no request for a wire transfer. There was no whining about unfairness. It was just a status update. Brian is working at a lumber yard in the next county. He wakes up at 5 in the morning. He stacks timber. He drives a forklift. He comes home with splinters in his hands and an ache in his back, but for the first time in his life, the money in his pocket is actually his. He told me he is renting a small studio apartment above a bakery. He told me he broke up with Brittany shortly after they moved, realizing that without my money to glue them together, they had nothing in common. He is learning how to cook. He is learning how to budget. He is learning that respect is found in the callus on your palm, not the logo on your shirt. He wrote that he misses me and that he is sorry. He said he isn't ready to visit yet, that he wants to have something to show for himself before he faces me again. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket right next to my heart. I am not sad. I am proud. It took a demolition, a flood, and a public humiliation to break the spell of entitlement that had consumed him, but the fever has finally broken. I took a sip of my tea, listening to the wind rustle through the new maple trees I planted. They say you cannot put a price on education, but I disagree. I spent $500,000 supporting a lie, and another $50,000 dismantling it. But as I look at the peace around me and think of the man my son is finally becoming, I know it was a bargain. The most expensive lessons are usually the most effective, and this one was worth every penny. This story reminds us that true wealth is not measured by luxury cars or designer labels, but by integrity and independence. Wallace showed us that enabling entitlement is not love. It is a trap that keeps people weak. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is let their child face the harsh consequences of their actions. Brian finally found his dignity, not in a mansion, but in honest work and self-reliance. Remember that boundaries are healthy, and respect is something you earn through character, not something you can buy with a credit card. If you agree with Wallace's tough love approach, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice served.